Bloomberg surveillance to learn how to look at markets, how to look at trends, and how to look younger.
What do you think, John? Botox, or do I really need to get something done?
I think, Tom, if we just change the style up a little bit.
You think so?
Yeah,
you
drop
great.
the bow tie. Drop the bow tie.
What, skinny tie?
Yeah. I always say, this is my line, whenever anyone in America has a go at me about a skinny tie, the older you get, the wider it gets.
Oh, really?
Until it becomes a bow tie.
This is a bow tie.
Until it becomes so fat, you just sort of...
Fauci and his team shared data about mixing vaccines. The vaccines can be mixed safely, and that's very good for people who got not Moderna vaccine, but want the Moderna vaccine for a booster because it's of a higher dose.
Live from New York, I'm Alex Steele with Francine Lacqua over in London. This is Bloomberg Markets. So far, U.S. stocks are looking at their best October since 2015, and many other asset classes have joined the rally over the past 4 weeks. Bloomberg's Kriti Gupta is here to measure the rally that we've seen. Hey, Kriti.
Hi, Alex. Well, this is going to be a really crucial October, not just because it's the last really biggest October since 2015, but also because we're coming off of a pretty tough September, and the trend historically has been if September is a brutal month for stocks, October tends to follow. That is until this month, where you do see a 5% rally in the S&P 500. A good chunk of that is coming from that risk sentiment from crude, from yields as well, but a lot of it is also coming from big tech in particular. So you do see that NASDAQ 100 outperformance up 6.5% on the month. I want to point out, though, that this is a global phenomenon. You are seeing stocks around the world higher. A lot of it actually showing up in the Hang Seng Index, which almost posted a double-digit growth number at its peak last week. So really important to talk about the fact that Chinese regulatory scrutiny has been keeping that part of the world under pressure, at least in the stock market. Now rebounding just a little bit. And a lot of this also has to do with what's going on in the bond market. This in particular with those inflation concerns, commodity prices rising, and people pulling up the rate hikes forward. So you do start to see the global curve flattening, not just here in the States, but around the world. And this really visualizes that nicely. Let's see, though, Alex and Fran, if the market is actually right, and if next week we'll see the FOMC actually follow the market's lead.
Yep, let's see. Kriti, thanks so much. Great work there, Kriti Gupta. Now joining us to talk more about the market, some of the funky moves maybe that we've seen in the bonds. Marilyn Watson, BlackRock, head of Global Fundamental Fixed Income Strategy team, joins us. Marilyn, always great to speak to you. Now, we were speaking to also Eddie Vajjavat from our MLive team, and he was saying, look, there's been some, a couple of very worrying moves. I don't know what you make of the inverted 20-30 yield curve and if it spells trouble ahead.
Well, we have certainly seen, as you say, some sort of funky moves, but I think this really comes on the back of, first of all, as you mentioned, a repricing in the markets of when they think interest rates might rise, maybe a little bit too aggressive, but we'll see. But we have certainly had already, we've had the Bank of Canada ending its QE program. We've had the Reserve Bank of Australia effectively ending its yield curve control. Next week, I think, will be critical when you have the Bank of England and the Fed, and I think the market is really expecting the Fed to begin its tapering process for ending its asset purchase process. And then, as you mentioned, we've had these still pretty high inflation numbers. I think going into next year, we're continuing to see these bottleneck issues in the supply side, alongside very strong demand still. And then I think to cap it all off, when you think that it's, coming into the month end, moving into the year end, we've had an incredibly strong performance in the equity market, and investors, pension funds have been taking down some of the risk in equities and putting them in the bond market as well. So I think the confluence of all of these things, from central banks through to strong equity markets, through to inflation, supply side, demand side, I think are all leading to these, quite extraordinary moves in the bond market.
What's going to be the top in rates? I mean, are we looking at zero on the 10-year bond yield, for example?
It's possible. I mean, I think yesterday was very interesting because the market really interpreted the ECB in the press conference afterwards as not really talking down the market pricing of rates. And certainly, we know we're going to see the end of the pandemic emergency purchase program by March 2022 next year. Nothing has been announced so far in terms of perhaps replacing that. And so I think, the market is getting a little bit more hawkish, and we could see zero. It's possible by the end of the year.
Marilyn, where do you find the most value right now? Is there anything, I don't know, I mean, there were, some pretty punchy moves also in Greek bond yields. Is there anything that you'd be buying right now?
So at the moment, we are still long duration in peripheral Europe. So in Italy, Spain, Greece, we are long duration versus short duration positions in Germany with short duration in the UK. We also like small allocations in emerging markets, and we continue to like the corporate bond market, but on a very, very specific bottom-up perspective. So we do continue to like some of the sort of the cash-rich, income-generating tech companies. We continue to like some of the healthcare bonds, and so it's really on a very much a case-by-case basis. But I think those companies that can continue to generate very high levels of cash and are investing in the future and investing in tech, we continue to like.
Why are you still long here? I mean, is that a technical thing? Is it an ECB thing? Or is it something else fundamental?
So at the moment, I think we continue to like some of the carry in the peripheral Europe, and we do think that we will continue to actually see those spreads compress again when we do start to see a shift. And we continue to see improving data in terms of GDP. Inflation is still below the long-run ECB target, but it is beginning to shift up a little bit. But I think we really in terms of the bond market, we want to get the carry, we want to get the yield, but we also want to have a very, very diversified portfolio where we really understand the liquidity issues and where we really can understand that it is becoming more and more dispersed, it's becoming more and more divergent, and we want to capture both the alpha and the beta where we see those opportunities.
Bonds that they could purchase next year?
It's possible that you might see something more. I think certainly going into December, I think all eyes will be on that meeting and to see whether there's more forward guidance on what the ECB might do, certainly to replace the pandemic emergency purchase program, and maybe they'll introduce some form of flexible envelope. I think yesterday it was surprising really how the market really interpreted it as being a little bit more hawkish. Mm-hmm. So it's possible that you might see a little bit more in terms of forward guidance, certainly in December.
Yeah, especially when the money markets are now pricing in that 20 bips of a rate hike in October rather than December of 2022. We were talking.
I think at the moment the central banks have a very, very tricky sort of tightrope to walk, because on the one hand they do want to step away from these incredibly loose monetary policy stances that these are these emergency measures that they put in at the beginning of the pandemic, and we're now in a very, very different environment when you think about the impact of the vaccine rollout, when you think about the very strong GDP growth that we've had. Even if it's starting to sort of temper a little bit, growth has been incredibly strong. This is probably one of the shortest recessions that the globe has ever seen. We support a very stable financial environment, and they don't want inflation to overshoot. Yeah. So it's a very, very tricky tightrope.
Yeah, it really is, and I'm sure not easy for you either. Marilyn Watson of BlackRock, thanks very much. We really appreciate that. Some breaking news for you. Moderna announced what it's going to supply in terms of the COVID-19 vaccine for the second quarter of 2022. It's going to supply up to 116.5 million doses in the second quarter for COVAX. And incidentally, we'll be speaking exclusively.
Absorbed into convenience platforms like that. Those are platforms that are just very convenient for people to conduct their day-to-day financial affairs. And it'd be very difficult for a bank to compete with that. Now, in some cases, I'd say, let's say in Africa, we are setting up a competing platform to the convenience platforms. And we're working with technology companies and mobile telephony companies and others to create a platform of our own. But for the most part, we're going to be playing on somebody else's platform.
BSO Now is your online home for...
It's time for the Bloomberg Business Flash, a look at some of the biggest business stories in the news right now. I'm John Hyland. Coca-Cola is close to buying a controlling stake in the sports drink maker Body Armor. Bloomberg has learned that a deal would value Body Armor at about $8 billion. In 2018, Coke acquired a minority stake in the company. Coke's primary sports drink Powerade is a distant competitor to PepsiCo's market-leading Gatorade. And Volvo Cars.
Facebook or Meta platforms, call it what you will, certainly had some company. And investors who are buying an ETF were actually getting a stake. And there was definitely a whole lot of money flowing in. I mean, a whole lot in relative terms, at least a little more than $18 million this week. A lot of that, no doubt, happening yesterday. But, you hadn't seen that kind of inflow since the shares were in vogue back in early September, at least.
Yeah, there's something I don't love about that story, though. All right, Dave, thanks a lot. Bloomberg's Dave Wilson joining us there on Meta Getting Meta at the end of the day. Okay, coming up, Chevron shares huge moves over in Italy. We're still looking at a 15 basis point move. Here, though, in the U.S., you're seeing a little bit of buying now come in at the long end as the short end keeps moving higher and that curve flattens. This is Bloomberg.
Of hell, the weight of purgatory and the sublime joy of paradise.
The digital humanities are a cultural occasion to exploit. Summing up, it's about merging humanistic disciplines with new technologies. I find this to be an innovating and modern tool to update culture. Cultural heritage becomes something to hand over to the new generations and not to be put aside. So it's about using technology, pixels, and binary code with a human and humanizing content.
I think that it's hard to put your head around any narrative. Let's just be honest. We've had sort of a shift in, are we in some sort of stagflation fears moment? People were talking about that all day yesterday.
Live from New York, I'm Alex Seal, along with Francine Lacqua over in London. This is Bloomberg Markets. So Chevron is targeting an increase in buybacks on this energy rally that we've seen. Now, the company posted record cash flow, more
return cash to shareholders, but our primary focus is on growing the dividend. Again, a dividend that's up 12% since COVID and up for 34 consecutive years.
Two more quick questions on buybacks, I promise. But I'm trying to understand what I should take away from your view on buybacks. It's important. You want it to be consistent. But I'm wondering if I can interpret that means we're not going to see $85 oil prices for the next 3 years, that we're not going to necessarily
manage the business for long-term value through the cycle. If we generate cash in excess of those, our top three priorities, we'll return in the form of buybacks. And again, we can generate a lot of excess cash.
One more question on this, and then I'll relieve you of the buyback conversation. There is currently a framework in D.C. where we could see a tax on buybacks. How do you think about that when you're thinking about buybacks?
Well, it's early days. We need to see all the text on capacity. Certainly some things that like steel that's tied to the general economy, but the energy specific infrastructure, there's a lot of talk of costs going up, but we're not seeing at this point in time. And even if we're seeing modest increases, they're still well below where they were pre-COVID. So our costs are well under control.
Great. That's surprising. I wasn't expecting that answer, Pierre, particularly in this environment. Same for wages, too?
We're again, on labor, we're seeing a little bit of tightness.
Surge in natural gas prices and power prices. They're coming down a little bit now with maybe Russia moving more gas into Europe. But there is a question, are we going to see the same kind of tightness in supply here in the U.S. that we've seen in Asia and in Europe?
Our capabilities, assets, and customers. And we think we have good shareholder support to pursue both a low growth, high return, lower carbon traditional energy business and faster growing, profitable new energy businesses that leverage our strengths.
But I do think what it brings up here, though, is that overall you can make the argument that at $85 oil, you guys, the stocks are just not valued appropriately. Like there's just a mismatch in what's actually happening versus the valuation. Do you think that's true?
Vehicles. These is basically the drones. These are the things that we see in attacks. That's not secret. So this is completely separate from the nuclear accord. But of course, Alex, we broke the news just 24 hours ago on this.
Civilization. What about wind power? Would you let them buy offshore wind power? That's infrastructure.
I think you'd have to
railways.
You'd have to look at you'd have to look at what was you're defining as strategic or critical.
pressures will ease. Now, of course, the link, Alex, between inflationary pressures and what we're seeing in the supply chain is very, very clear. If you have supply chain issues, people are ready to actually pay a lot more for that good that's coming from China or elsewhere. So coupled with higher energy prices, when you look at the recovery.
Records really across the board, 4.2 trillion in terms of total client assets across Merrill Lynch, our private bank, and our online business. Record revenues up 20%.
About, do they want to go to cash because they worry about a downturn?
Yeah, but I mean, our clients they are very long-term, of course, in their focus. Our clients really see their portfolios revolving around their life goals. That's what a lot of our conversation's about. And so those goals, whether it's children education, retirement, second home, are usually 5, 10, 20 years out in the future. Therefore, the portfolios that are set, they tend to tilt toward equities. Today, 4,000 new relationships just this year in Florida. So Florida's a hotspot. Yeah. California's a hotspot, as you'd expect. But we're seeing growth in areas around the country. Our growth in suburban Detroit has been exceptionally strong. Our growth around Washington has been very strong.
Has been spread all over the world and has this ability to create mutations and variants.
Almost to the close on European trading on this Friday. Katerina Utomael, Alliance Senior European Economist, will be...
Actually, on the month, if you look at equity stocks in Europe overall, they're still, gaining about 4%. We're short of like 1 basis point of a percentage to that all-time record high. But look, if you're the ECB, you're not catching a break because you say, believe me, inflation is transitory, and then the next day you have 4% print. We haven't seen, I think it's the second time we've seen it in like 3 decades.
Yeah, I mean, Amazon and Apple, they're both down an accumulative like 7%. Overall, that's wiping out about $160 billion in market value. So 2 things. One, Amazon is...
About that at the moment, it seems like the perfect storm for inflation, and everything is driving rates up. It was an intense inflation week. In the spirit of Halloween, there was one inflation scare almost every day. So clearly that's still driven by the shortages, supply chain issues that we're seeing, and of course also energy prices in Europe now. Austria have already passed this one. We see that Germany is not making so much progress anymore. I think for the ECB, what really matters is the medium-term outlook. So really what we'll look for in the December projections, so the new macroeconomic projections put forward in December, will be the outlook on inflation for 2023 and 2024. And I think President Lagarde has already indicated that it could well be, or it's likely that these are here also for the 10 years.
Katerina, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. A great analysis. Katerina Utomael, Allianz Senior European Economist. Thank you very much. All right, coming up, President Biden wants...
Visit Bloomberg.com webinars.
Let's check in on the Bloomberg First Word News now. I'm John Hyland. In the UK.
Yeah, John, thank you so much. Really interesting to hear there from the French finance.
But very, very slim majorities in the House and the Senate. How can he deliver on a global stage when he is meeting with these world leaders? And where this really comes to focus is, of course, on climate. The U.S. wants to halve emissions by the end of the decade. We're going into COP26. He wants to be a climate president, as you said.
People are beginning to build some momentum, I think. The question is, will it be enough?
We'll speak with global leaders, keep you up to date on progress and setbacks, and analyze what it all means to you.
We're going to need to see some real action.
COP26.
Sparkling rosé, for example, but for the really high alcoholic stuff, and I'm assuming that might mean whiskey, taxes will go up. And that's, I mean, they say it's like, oh, we want to help your health, but let's put that aside for a second. I don't know if that's going to make a difference if you're a heavy alcohol lover of the high alcohol content.
Yeah, I mean, when you...
Watch Bloomberg Surveillance to learn how to look at markets, how to look at trends, and how to look younger?
What do you think, John? Botox, or do I really need to get something done?
I think today, because of course they do some of the things that are used in some of these big technology companies. Now, NatWest, one of the biggest losers in today's trading session. This is a big bank here.
This company, most of their revenue comes from Europe, EMEA. If we take a look at a breakdown, we are going to see the pie here. So 57% comes from Europe and the Middle East. There was some weakness there in Europe. Some thought, though, that it could have to do with the slower vaccine rollout. So there's actually maybe a silver lining here. Hope that 2022 that there could be some.
ECUs on our combine, we have 43 computers that control different things. Each one of those has a or multiple chips in them, features on the machine. So demand is strong. This little bit of pricing we've had to put into the market is digestible by the market.
We're also looking at farmers, etc., dealing with rising input costs of their own, or wage issues. Deere, for example, hit with a strike. What's the impact for you guys?
Biden, the second U.S. Catholic president, previously met with Francis at the Vatican in 2016 when he was vice president. And British workers are facing 3 years of barely rising living standard thanks to inflation. New government projections suggest that after adjustments for prices, average earnings will be little higher at the end of 2024 than they are now. Millions of Britons effectively went more than a decade without a pay raise following the...
So we're very pleased last week when the US FDA authorized the ball, but we're going to work hard to make it available everywhere, of course.
Stefan, how safe do you think your vaccine for 5 to 11-year-olds is, given it's 5 times the dose used in Pfizer's shot?
Yeah, so the data, as we communicated on Monday, is very strong in terms of safety. And so we think the vaccine is safe. That's what we communicated. The data is going to be shared with the FDA, of course, as always, and be published in peer-reviewed journal. 2020, at the beginning of a pandemic, we thought that the big pharma company will get vaccines. And as we know, several vaccines have unfortunately failed into the clinic. And also we didn't know that the Moderna vaccine will be the one showing the highest efficacy and
and we'll do better next time.
Yep, and President Macron says that, ahead of these talks, we're building trust, does see more areas of cooperation.
Состояние, наверное, организм истощен, потому что очень много физической работы. Своим вот этим поступком хотел сказать, что только через действие.
Framework and are making progress. Are the progressives really
well on deadlines? You saw a lot of movement even when those arbitrary deadlines were coming up. So it's a big question mark at this point. You've heard some lawmakers say, hey, we can get this done by the end of next week. But really the only firm deadline that lawmakers are operating with right now is December 3rd. That's when that stopgap highway funding, that
be a contractual conversation. It doesn't mean it has to take months. It's something that we can do now. And protect children and families during this moment.
We just saw an image of you in the subway system, Eric Adams, and spoke at this time yesterday with your opponent, who is calling for thousands more police officers to be added to the city's subways, with crime as the #1.
And I believe it should be done immediately. It is my desire to get this resolved within the first year. Let's put together a task force that sits down and come up with real recommendations and solutions. It is unfair and has been unfair for far too long.
President Biden is, of course, in Europe as you and I speak right now, and next week he'll be at the UN Climate Summit as the debate rages here in Washington over climate provisions in the reconciliation bill.
To have the dollars to come in to renew our infrastructure, and at the same time, we could employ people with a real...
Eric, thanks for talking with us today. And David Weston, we send it back to you.
Okay, thank you so much to Joe. Joe Matthew, of course, you can catch every day of the week on Bloomberg Radio on Sound On. Coming up, we talk with Elaine Kamark of Brookings Institution about President Biden's leadership on his economic agenda. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and on radio. Better agenda yesterday before he left for Europe. But it's not not really clear how much more than an announcement he really got. To give us a perspective on how his leadership is working in Washington, the
mysteries, because I heard that yesterday too, that people were surprised that he did not ask for the vote. I mean, just think back to Lyndon Johnson, right? Lyndon Johnson would have walked around that entire room, gotten up within 2 inches of their face, masks and all, and said, "Are you with me?" Right? And he would have gotten them to commit. I don't know what happened. Perhaps it was his feeling and the feeling of the speaker that they couldn't push it.
Almost every employer is having trouble finding workers. Those seem to me to be the conditions for inflation to take a ratchet up from the 2% level we've been used to, unless somebody
This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg Television and Radio. I'm David Weston. For Bloomberg First Word News, we go now to Mark Crumpton.
David, thank you. Today's the deadline for all municipal employees in New York City to have received at least their first COVID vaccine shot. Nearly a third of the city's police officers are unvaccinated. According to the police union, 10,000 of the city's 35,000 uniformed cops. Sudan's coup leader is trying to persuade the ousted prime minister to reassume his role on the condition the army chooses a new cabinet.
It's going to be a really critical factor that should lean in Terry McAuliffe's favor, but we'll watch that election night.
So, Senator, I certainly take your point about how close it was for you back in 2005, but the state seems to have changed some since 2005. As I recall, President Trump lost that state by 10 points just a short time ago. So why, given that, shouldn't the state be really indicating it should be going Democrat?
Thin, and I think when the dust settled, thing they most wanted to do, and that was repeal the Affordable Care Act. Now, that would be their top goal. I still don't get it, but that was their top goal. But they forced a vote on the floor of the Senate when they didn't have 50 votes. They had 52 Republicans, but they lost 3 votes, and Democrats were able to save health insurance for 25 or 30 million people. So when the margins are this thin, the majority